Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk all about axle shafts, and I'm going to show you guys how to actually change your U-joint in your axle shaft with nothing but basic hand tools and a bench vise. So let's dive right in. This video shouldn't be all that long. Now, a couple of things about axle shafts. This is the factory axle shaft out of a Super Duty Dana 60, and that's what I currently have inside of Warpaint with 40-inch tires, and it's held up just fine. There are some weaknesses, and you could upgrade to a chromoly axle shaft, which would do away with a lot of those weaknesses. But let's dive in, take a closer look, and let's talk about what the differences and weaknesses are in a standard axle shaft with a U-joint. Now, one of the main weaknesses of the U-joint style axle shaft is the fact that this U-joint can come two ways. It can be solid or it can be greasable. Now, if it's greasable like this one is, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little grease zerk down in there. The inside of this is actually going to have a hollow channel in it, which will allow the grease to get up into the bearings in all of these end caps. There are 4 of them. A solid one will be a lot stronger because it doesn't have that hollow channel in here, but it's not greasable. So pros and cons. The other downside of a U-joint is that it's perfectly strong when your wheel is straight, but as soon as you put some steering into that axle, the bigger angle, the weaker this U-joint gets, even if it is solid. Now, I don't want to make you think that running an axle shaft with a U-joint on your Jeep is a bad idea, because it isn't. In fact, it's all I've ever done. There is a company out there called RCV that actually makes a different style axle shaft with a CV joint in the end that doesn't get any weaker when you turn your wheel. However, I don't think they're always 100% necessary in most applications. Most people going out there with your typical 35, 37, or even a 40-inch tire, you're going to be okay most of the time with an axle shaft, depending upon your wheeling style. Now, upgrading to something like an RCV would be a good idea if you're making a ton of power, and they even come as big as a 40 spline axle shaft in things like the Super Duty. Now, on a Dana 30 or a Dana 44, which is a very, very common axle in the Jeeps, your U-joint is going to be pretty small. It's going to be a 1310. And if you upgrade to a chromoly axle shaft, they actually give you a 1350 U-joint, which is solid and therefore a lot stronger. Now, one of the ways that you can make your axle shaft with a U-joint last a little bit longer is to make sure that everything on the Jeep is maintained. And as soon as you start to see some play in that U-joint, you swap it out, which I'll show you in just a second how to do. But the other thing that you can do is when you're pulling into an obstacle, keep in mind that that axle, like we said a minute ago, when it's turned, it's weaker. So if you're pulling into something that's undercut, it's best to pull into it and have that tire be straight on instead of at an angle. Now, if you have to attack it on an angle, as little angle as possible, if you can, is definitely the best way to approach something like that to make sure that that U-joint has the most strength in it that it can possibly have. This is also just another reason why when you upgrade to a bigger tire, like something like a 40-inch tire, or even maybe a little bit smaller, if it's a sticky, you're going to want to go to a 1-ton axle. Now, in Warpaint, I said a minute ago, I run these axles. These are factory. These are not chromoly axles, and they're perfectly fine. This year happens to also be a 35 spline inner and a 35 spline outer. So it's pretty thick and super strong. But again, chromoly is a whole nother ball game. The steel is a lot stronger. It can take a lot more abuse and twist a lot farther before it breaks. So that's something that you may want to look into. And in fact, I'll probably wind up swapping them out on Warpaint eventually. But for the moment, they seem to work just fine. But let's dive in and let's start disassembling and removing the old U-joint, and then we can start talking about how to press in the new one. There are basically 4 caps that we need to remove in order to get this U-joint out. You want to start removing the ones on the stub shaft on the short side first. You could do the ones on the long side first, but it makes then removing the stub shaft a lot more difficult. So what we're gonna do first is remove all 4 of these little clips. I don't know, hopefully you guys can see it in there. There's a little circle clip that goes all the way around and kind of locks in. All you need to do is get a screwdriver and a hammer and you can tap that circle clip out. If you've noticed, mine looks kind of wet, and that's because I sprayed it with a penetrant to make that process a little bit easier. Now you're just gonna wanna get in there with the screwdriver basically at the back side of that C-clip, start tapping it with the hammer, and it should start pushing it right out. Once you get it out far enough, you can basically just stick your screwdriver in there and pop it out. You're going to want to do that to all 4 corners, removing all 4 clips of your U-joint. Now, after all 4 of those circle clips are removed, you basically want to support one end of your axle shaft so that it's pretty much straight and level in your vise. Then you want to take your vise, open it up, and basically lay the 2 ears of the longer side axle shaft, the inner shaft, on top of the vise, allowing basically the stub shaft to kind of hang down in there. At this point, we're going to just hold our stub shaft up, take a hammer, hit this side, and it'll pound it down, driving this cap up and out. Those circle clips, these guys here, are what hold that cap basically into this ear and secure all the bearings. And you would just remove the cap, but be careful, there might be a bunch of bearings inside of this. Well, there definitely will be. When you pull that cap off, sometimes those bearings like to go all over the place. Just like that. Now, hopefully the lighting is good enough and you guys can see what I was talking about, but obviously this bearing was dry of grease. And these are the bearings. These are called needle bearings. There's basically a bunch of them that sit between the cap and the U-joint, which allow it to basically turn and do its thing. We're removing those little bearings are just gonna go everywhere. But at this point, we're gonna flip it over, drop out the rest of those bearings, and do the same thing to the other side to remove the other cap. Then just remove your stub shaft. Now at this point, we're basically just gonna roll it over onto its side and rest the U-joint itself inside of the vise and use the U-joint now as the thing that'll hold it, so we can hammer on this side, lift that cap out, flip it over, do the same thing to the other side. Guys, I just want to take a quick second in the middle of this video to ask you guys to please subscribe to support the channel. If you guys like what we're doing here with the vehicle builds and all the how-tos, please make sure that you take a second to subscribe. We have giveaways starting soon, even some vehicle giveaways coming up. Stay tuned for that. In order to be entered, you're gonna have to be a subscriber. So it's free. All you need is a Gmail account. Just make sure you have that, and you can click that subscribe button. It's a new day. Our axle shafts are sanded down, painted nicely. Make sure if you're gonna do that, that you leave the seal mating surface unpainted. Wrap some painter's tape around it. Don't paint the splines, things like that. But they're ready to go. So let's talk about our U-joints. Now, this is obviously our old one. This is our new one. The new one looks a lot bigger. It's not. It's the same size. I just have the caps on it, except for here. Now, our old one was greasable, right? This is where that Zerk fitting was, I pointed out earlier. And that hole obviously allows that grease to flow in and then flow to all the bearing caps and get in there with all those little bearings. Now, I don't always recommend going with greasable U-joints. And the reason for that is if you get a non-greasable, that hole isn't there, that U-joint is solid, therefore a lot stronger. However, If your vehicle is something that sees a lot of miles and things like that, a greasable U-joint is not that big of a deal, and I would definitely recommend using it. In our application, the owner of Project Maple Leaf wanted to go with a greasable U-joint, so that's what we're doing. Something I always like to do when we're about to put in new U-joints is take a little bit of grease and just put it around the inside of the ears on the axle shafts. It just makes those new bearing caps slide in there a lot easier. And when you're done with that, you're going to want to remove all of the caps off of the U-joint and set them off to the side. But you're going to want to do it nice and carefully to make sure that these needle bearings don't get displaced inside of there. Now, it usually doesn't happen because there's a fair amount of grease inside of these. And if there isn't, I would want to take some grease and actually pack it in there. But these actually have quite a bit of grease on them already, so I'm not going to worry about it. Now we're going to take our U-joint, actually slide it back into our axle shaft. Take one of the bearing caps, kind of slide it on to the top. We're going to flip it over, put it down on the anvil portion of our vise and help it in by hitting it again with a hammer. Now that that's in, we're going to take our next cap and we're going to put it on the top and slide it in nicely, making sure that our caps don't actually wind up getting the needle bearings displaced. And we're just going to basically directly hit on top of the cap and drive it down in. Now, once that's done, inspect both sides and take a look at which side has more of that groove exposed where your circle clip is going to go. On ours, it looks like this one's pretty good. So I'm going to take my circle clip and just push it in. Now, if you had something like a Dana 30, you can often just push in that circle clip by hand. But with this one, I might have to push it in. Oh, nope, we did it by hand. Okay, so sometimes, like I said, with a Dana 30, you're going to have to push it in by hand because the circle clips are smaller and therefore not as heavy duty. With a Dana 60, a lot of the time, the circle clip is a little bit thicker, a little bit harder to push in. Sometimes some light taps with a hammer will help send it home. Once you have that first circle clip in, you're going to want to flip it over and hit the hammer on the other cap, pushing it down a little bit deeper so you can get the circle clip on that side as well. All right, so for the next one, we're gonna pretty much do the same thing. We're just gonna slide it over, put our first cap on, put it back on the anvil. Make sure we hold our stub shaft kind of straight, give it some taps, and push it back on. Now we're gonna do the same thing to the other side. Put those circle clips in the same way. And guys, there we have it. Our brand new looking used junkyard Dana 60 axle shaft with a new U-joint that happens to be greasable inside of it. These should last us a good long time on our Super Duty 60 with 40-inch tires, rock crawling Project Maple Leaf. Get on over, make sure you check out that build series. It's gonna be pretty cool. No one's really seen a JKU on leaf springs with 14 inches of travel. So make sure you check that out. And guys, there you have it. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, drop a comment, and that's it, all right? Have a great one, get out there and build something.